Bam. Say, John, this is John Langellier, and you're watching.
This is John Langellier, and you're watching the Break It Down.
There is a little bit of a lag on our conversation. We'll have to work through that. John is a PhD. He's a historian, and he covers a part of the world that just fascinates me to no end. The Old West, South Tucson, northern Mexico, the cavalry, the artillery, military from the 1850s to the 1900s. All of these things are in his purview, his wheelhouse. And he does a lot of things like he does private tours where you can hire him and he walks around and he points at things that happened back in the old days. And I just I love this part of history. What is it, John, that makes, because I know you love it too, what is it that makes this time of history? And it's recent history. I mean, there's people that are grandkids that are still alive and people that were alive during this time.
In essence, it's the myth of the Old West is entangled with the reality of the frontier, and many of us, at least of my generation, difficult separating one from the other was part and parcel of our life, even if we grew up in Illinois or at Minneapolis or wherever, because of Western film, Western television, even radio and fiction. Much of that has disappeared today. TV shows, obviously, and films take different directions from aliens to zombies to what have you. But it still is probably the time of the country that defined it as being unique from other countries in certain respects. Origin myth.
So my part of my ancestry goes back to Sac, Minnesota, all the Swedes that moved in, right? And they continued to move west and homestead and try to sort out where they were going to go. And if it worked, you stayed there. But if it didn't, you ended up often going south to Texas because there was oil there at some point. There was opportunity. Is there any like a pattern to the ethnic immigration across the U.S.? Like, you know, New York is a port of entry. People leave there and go somewhere else. Is there any kind of link to the ethnicities that moved into that kind of region?
Well, actually, there are. You would have an Italian section, a German Jewish section of New York, or any of the big cities. Some of those same draws, people bonding together with like people, would end up either in Minnesota, Swedes, or other people from the Scandinavian countries out in lumber country or farming country, or raising wheat on the Great Plains in the Dakotas or what have you. And there was some of the same thing with the Germans going into Kansas and into Texas. So groups of people would cluster, sometimes with a leadership that would bring them out to an area that would convince them that some other folks from Bavaria should, because there was no, of course, Germany until later in the post-Civil War era, or from Ireland to flee the potato famines. These are the same people who, while they were fleeing something or looking for something better, were perhaps arguably more adventurous and independent than the folks who stayed at home and well enough known status quo. There were waves of immigrations. Obviously, first immigrations come out of Mexico after the Spanish conquistadors arrive in Mexico and begin to push up into what became Texas and New Mexico, Arizona, California. And there would be that frontier. Well, there would be the frontier of Canada, which was originally France, and people come from Normandy or elsewhere and settle in a hard life in the North Country. But again, for the first time, having certain freedoms from the crown, from certain types of things, whether it be religious freedom or just a freedom to try and seek a better life. Sometimes they achieved that, oftentimes they did not, and died in the trying. My background specifically looks at the military's role in this, and of course today there's a kind of a term that people use within the academic world, which is settler colonialism. That means settlers come out, whether they be Swedes, Italians, or French Canadians, or whatever, and establish themselves in another area and ultimately colonize an area, pushing out the First Peoples, as the Canadians refer to Native Americans, and to essentially usurp the land and in some respects either overcome or in certain cases destroy cultures. And of course, the military plays a major role in that. But they're just minor imps of Satan. The real imps of the real great Satan is, of course, big business, government.
So big business,
be it
right?
Black
Business.
soldiers, white soldiers, or go ahead.
I was going to say big business creating
Business
the
as
need.
usual, so to speak. Yes, well, of course, there's first the mineral wealth, there's mineral wealth, there's the railroads. All that is part of a national, even going back as far as the fur trade, where the fur trade is the first .com sort of thing, where people press out west because there's a craze for fur.
That craze for fur and other, lumber and trying to connect the nation from the coast to the other coast, all of these things, they're inevitable though, right? Like there's always that battle between development and preservation, conservation and preservation. How do you use the resources you have? How do you also preserve what's there? This is a human battle that we've always had. Is it not?
Essentially, the first humanoid that stepped out of Africa into the rest of the world to populate the world starts it because they're going to push something, whether it's the game or whatever. And as humans spread and diversity spreads, diversity doesn't always bring, shall we say, complementary relationships. And so there always seems to be the presence, the Mongols coming out of somewhere, or the British going out to an empire where the sun never set. So it seems the history, sadly to say, the history of mankind and often utilizing those resources is not the best for anyone. We overutilize the resource, we deforest, we do whatever. But at the time when somebody landed in the 17th century in the Americas, it was literally a new world, a world that allowed them to do something that they could not do back in Spain or England or Ireland, and pressed on thinking that it was limitless. Everything was available. If you stepped on the shore, on the east coast in Massachusetts, it seemed like the world would never end, that the world was maybe flat and just.
We just celebrated a holiday that's sometimes called Indigenous Peoples Day. Sometimes it's called Columbus Day. And we struggle with Columbus. I wrote a post about this and just saying he's a conflicting figure. Like we're all downstream of Columbus, and someone was going to come and start this flood to this area. But we tend to not have enough contextual knowledge to understand what it was like to be an explorer back in that day. And we have the belief that conquistadors and people like Columbus just slaughtered people at the first opportunity, which happened, but there also was a lot of diplomacy and other things that they tried as well. Can you help us not understand Columbus necessarily, but can you help us understand what the norm was, the context of these efforts to go out and look? There's precious metals in Arizona, so people are going to go there. There's oil in Texas, so people are going to go there, right? These things are valuable. Can you help us understand the context of the time and of the people that would do these types of adventures?
Well, of course, we'll concentrate on the Spanish since I'm in the Southwest, and just from a tour with Stephen Ambrose historical tours on the Apache and the long-standing conflict with those people who aren't really Apaches at all, but that's what we've come to call them. At any rate, if you think about it, the Spanish had spent 7 centuries essentially from the arrival of the Moors in the Iberian Peninsula to 1492, that magic date when not only Columbus sailed, but essentially Granada, the last bastion of Islam, fell into the hands of Ferdinand and Isabella, who are now concentrating and creating one of the first nation states in Europe, because many of the states are still disjointed for generations. So there really is no Great Britain until much later, united under the Tudors, and even then Scotland and England and even Wales to a certain degree would be factionalized and brought together eventually. So Spain spent seven centuries roughly, in this reconquista back the land of Spain, creating a nation state, and then essentially looking for means to not only gain wealth, because or you use wealth, you mainly one of your main portions of your national, your population dies in one way or the other, either as soldiers or during the famine, victims of a siege or what have you. And so you're looking for wealth, but also this is a religious war. Just as Islam has its religious wars, the Spanish had their religious wars, and the Inquisition comes in at that time. So they're looking for dual situations. They're looking for the riches, the cities of India, not such at that time for gold and silver, but ultimately that will become the reason to talk for many of the explorations. But they're looking to save souls, to convert people who are infidels in their mind. And so they arrive with the sword in one hand and the cross in the hand. Unfortunately, another thing they arrive with is disease that definitely wipes large sections of the population. They also ultimately also get the people as conquered people and perhaps as lesser people. And there's an argument within theological contexts and others that the native they encounter are, even though they're not Christian, they're human. They're equal to the European, the Spaniard, and others. And there's that dichotomy. But looking down on these people allows to enslave them, to use their power that they have, their power in terms of their physical power to work for you, to mine, to harvest whatever you're going to grow in this new world or what have you, and turn it back into wealth king for a number of people have come here. A small number of Spanish arrive in this country. And it's mainly, for instance, in Mexico that they'll succeed, not because they had cannons and horses per se and fire. Actually, the firearms themselves were somewhat compared to an Aztec who could launch arrows or spears or something at a much more rapid pace than you could load a primitive weapon of that era. But they also have numerous allies, because there are no such thing any more than there is no such thing as an Apache. There's some such thing as an Indian. And as a consequence, these people saw themselves differently from the Aztecs. They were a specific people with their own culture, their own languages, and they saw the Spanish to some degree as saved to drive out the Aztecs. That becomes the story throughout much, whether it's Spanish, you obtain their freedom, and they pit one group against the other. So they'll use Crow Scouts against the Cheyenne or the Lakota people, the so-called Sioux people. They will use numerous tribal groups here in Arizona and the Southwest, including Apaches, because again, Apaches are a linguistic group who refer to themselves amongst others as the Inde, what have you. There's about 6 major subdivisions of the so-called Apache, plus numerous other divisions of these Athabascan speaking people who go all the way to the Pacific Northwest and into Alaska. They're somewhat cousins, if you will, the Diné, the Navajo. And these people arrived, arguably, some people say, about 1,000 years ago, so-called Apaches, into what we know as this American Southwest. Others say it was 400 or 500 years ago. Be that as it may, their name is taken, we believe, from the Zuni word Apache, which means Apache actually, which means enemy. So they were seen as the outsiders, even as they arrived here, and they were not a people like the Pueblo people or the Tohoto down here in Arizona, southern Arizona, where they're agricultural people who've grown crops for time immemorial. They're raider people. They go into this to the wall, having never seen anything on the shelves, and snatch and grab and take off. Once they achieve horses from the Spanish to a certain degree, that enhances their ability to raid, and horses become a commodity, not so much so they are, say, amongst the Comanches, where the Comanches are, in some respects, the ultimate light cavalry and horse people in the New World. But having said that, there's this conflict from the very beginning of people who are pre-contact people, who are pre-Apache arrival people, the Apaches themselves, and then the conflict that will begin with the arrival of the Spanish in the 16th century and last well into the late 19th century as it morphs from the Spanish to the Mexican government to the government of the United States. And so centuries of conflicts, even though there's a relatively new book, excellently written by Dr. Paul Hutton, who sets the Apache Wars as the longest war in U.S. history. But he focuses on an incident that takes place with the Chiricahua chief, Cochise the Chocan. There are sub-bands of the Chiricahuas, just as there are bands of the Toreo Apache, all these various Apache groups, and focuses on an event that takes place about the time of the outbreak of the American Civil War. Well, that's a very colorful story and such, but this is a conflict that goes back before anybody who spoke Spanish, English came to this area, a conflict between the peoples who lived here before any of these outsiders came in. And as I say, would continue and escalate over generations. The Spanish attempted everything from almost genocide to buy off the Apache to the Mexicans going into the scalp business to offer 100 pesos for a man's scalp, 50 for and 25 for a child, and hire mercenaries from Ireland and the United States and elsewhere to go in and do their bidding, which obviously backfired. The man we know as Geronimo Gayacola, the man who yawns, his family was killed by the Mexicans, and forever thereafter he had hatred for the Spanish. And then, of course, later the Mexicans, who he knew more about because he was from the era of the Mexican Republic forward.
Part of the early history of the U.S. is the opportunity to go out and settle lands, and the U.S. encouraging people to go out and settle lands, whether it was free land grants or proving up a claim or whatever it was going to be. And to establish a nation across 4,000 miles of east-west distance, you have to have a government presence. So the post office and the military were the things that said, hey, we are a nation, right? A new one, right? Not even 75 years old. I mean, deep into the 1800s, but you know that we're going to protect you and we're going to do these things. So part of this warring thing is also allowing the U.S. to establish itself as a viable nation, even if it isn't very well populated. Is there another way to do that? To make a nation out of something where you're kinder and gentler and respecting of, I don't know, the whole eastern half of Oklahoma that's now part of Indian territory again?
Well, in some respects, there probably is, but it would take both sides willing to give up autonomy or their land, their traditional lands, because don't forget, to a Native American, there is no Arizona or California or the Mexican border, which is the United States border. That's a construct that comes out of an entirely different type of thinking, European thinking of other cultures that are not indigenous to this continent, nor to this hemisphere, for that matter, in many respects. So meets and bounds make no sense. If we had not come to this continent, there would still have been war, because once again, these factions, whether there be the so-called Apache, the Inde, versus the Tohono O'odham, the Pueblo peoples, or what have you, would not form a rainbow coalition. They did not see themselves as neighbors and friends. Sometimes they would make alliances. They're sometimes very sophisticated alliances that lasted a long time. And indeed, amongst the Apaches, for instance, there's a lot of intermarriage. Cochise would be married to a great chief's daughter, and in turn, Geronimo would marry one of Cochise's daughters. So unlike the old feudal systems in Europe or Asia or elsewhere, where families would intermarry with families to cement relationships. But in terms of, is this inevitable? It seems to be the history that it is inevitable. Is it right? That's a whole different question. And we can't, of course, while we can't live in the past, we can hopefully appreciate some of the things they did and hopefully understand that they're not the things that we should be doing again today. seemingly we might have some lessons of the expansion of the American West, so-called manifest destiny. Somebody in Moscow seems to have taken a page out of that book right now in the small Eastern European countries. So the beat goes on, regrettably. The military was only part and the parcel of it. It's, of course, as you pointed out, it's everything from the post office and law and order, and then, of course, the establishment of the railroad, which is the biggest factor in many respects, in my mind. So much larger than the military ever did to carving up the West. It wasn't the gun that won the West, it was the locomotive in many respects that won the West. It made it possible for ever-growing numbers of immigrants to leave the eastern United States and elsewhere and come out to the West for a relatively inexpensive trip rather than months of peril facing something like the Donner Party would at one point, or many other groups of people would, perishing along the way individually or in large numbers. And as a consequence, that railroad made it possible for people to come less easier, plus get their goods back to the market. In Chicago, New York, and elsewhere, to feed a hungry nation, to ship out materials that would go overseas and make America from a colonial power, if you will, to an international global imperialistic power by the time the Spanish-American War came. Some of those same soldiers who fought in what became known as the Indian Wars were the same guys who go up San Juan Hill and in certain respects saved Teddy Roosevelt's bacon, because Roosevelt knew much less about military tactics and warfare than I know about rocket science.
Yeah, that's funny. One of the other things too we lose sight of today is if we put a bunch of people on a boat and sail them over to what it would be Mexico, and Montezuma is there doing Montezuma things to people around him, we would lose our ever-loving minds. And when we think, that's not true, we went to Afghanistan and had a problem with how they treated their women, how they treated young boys, how they, and it just kept going. Like even rule of law, your rule of law is not up to our standards. And so we act in the same ways just 600 years later, but we lose sight of that, right?
Precisely. And what's one of the terms that's still left over from Vietnam and even in the Middle East? We're going out into Indian country. I think you're John Wayne going out there. Instead of on your V or whatever, your Bradley fighting vehicle, but it's leaving the fort to go out into Indian country. Yeah. And so the Presidios. You're in California. I'm here in Arizona. You've been to the Presidio, San Francisco, and all the Presidio was a vestige of Roman. It comes from the Roman Presidio, fortified place. The Romans would up down, eventually build a wall to keep those evil Scots out, which we all want to keep out unless they're bringing whiskey, and then we'll talk to them. But this is a concept that goes back. Great Wall of China, people pressing on, and then something as their own may or may not. They have the right to take it by power, but not perhaps the ethical right to take it, or to engage in nation building by nation changing. And that's what, in essence, almost every power on the planet who's spread out is set to do, whether the British in India, or the French in Algeria, or we in the Philippines, where we, after a war of liberation, we stayed until the Japanese took over the islands, and then we finally vacated the islands almost 50 years after us coming to bring freedom and American way, that had a pretty good way of doing things themselves, and had some patriots like Emilio Aguinaldo, who was essentially George Washington to a certain degree of that, and became an independent nation. But a long time after he died, a long time after we withdrew our forces.
It's just funny when we think about like how we look at these things in the social eye, not the historian's eye, and we become so judgmental, and yet we're guilty of the same things. And I just love making that point, because when you get in something as complex as the Apache War, where there really is no answer except for the imposition of will, and you'll often hear people say violence is not an answer, but violence is also the answer in a lot of cases, and that leads to like, hey, this violence is horrible. Let's try something else now. But you have to be willing to do that. So the way I see it, and I want you to correct me where I'm wrong, in the Apache Wars, you have the U.S. interest, the Mexican interest, the Apache interest, and then these ranchers that are like, these are not soft people. These are not timid people. These are not people that you're going to come up and take things from if they have any say. So they're almost a different faction altogether. Um, how does that all blend together? How does U.S. Mexican relations impact this? I mean, there's a border there, and you're supposed to kind of, sort of, not supposed to go across it unless you need to, right? So, explain the four sides and how that all blends together into that chaos soup that was the Apache Wars.
Well, let's start with the border, which is a great construct. It doesn't exist to the Apache mind. It doesn't exist to the Yaqui mind or to Tarahumara or whatever the native peoples who live along there, the Comanche, what have you. It's just a place that sometimes has a river to cross or whatever, but it's if you're pursuing buffalo, you can say, oh, in Mexico after those bison because they've gone to Mexico. Well, there exists in a very finite way by the arrival of the Spanish, who create something called the provincias internas, the internal provinces, with a good Spanish commandant general in charge, Hugo O'Connor, an Irishman who's in charge of the Spanish army on the frontier. And they established these presidios in a cordon, and that's to keep the Comanches in check theoretically, and the Apaches, etc. It doesn't succeed. They don't have the wherewithal to do it. They're stretched too thin, just as many empires eventually grow too thin. Whether they're the Romans, the British, whatever, they can't hold on to everything that's far flung. Well, it goes away with the arrival of the Mexican Revolution and the successful creation of first the Mexican empire itself, which is very short lasted. They have emperor for less than 2 years, and then it becomes a republic. But the Mexicans have no more wherewithal to do than the Spanish did. They're trying to keep everything from San Francisco all the way down into Oaxaca and the borderlands with the Guatemala, etc. And they can't do it, particularly in these far-flung areas along Sonora and Chihuahua and in the Texas, New Mexico, Arizona, where they have fierce people to face. And so that all breaks down, and who steps in? But in the 1840s, Texas has its revolution, creates a republic. That republic then is swept into the United States. Some people are against that particular movement, and some people are in the war that ensues from, including a young one-term congressman by the name of Abraham Lincoln from Illinois, who opposes James K. Polk, the president. At the end of the war, we signed a treaty with Mexico, the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, and we essentially form what becomes the basis of the border as we know it today. And we make certain pledges in that situation to honor the language, the customs, the religions of the people who are the forebears of today's Latinos or Mexicanos, Mexican Americans, whatever term one chooses for these early peoples that are here. But we essentially also say in that same treaty, we will protect you in Mexico. We will stop marauding people from coming from our country, meaning the Apache, the Comanche, and marauding into your country. And you're to do likewise if people come up into our country, whether they be native peoples or whether they be revolutionaries who are Juan Cortina, who's looking to take back lands lost by the Mexican people in the Mexican War thereafter. And we come up with a second situation where we do a purchase, the Gadsden Purchase, because we buy parts of Arizona, southern Arizona, and parts of southern New Mexico, southwestern New Mexico, southeastern Arizona for the railroad, particularly because it's a all-weather route, because we've been looking since the 1850s and even to a certain degree earlier than that for routes across the continent that would be passable for railroads and other forms of transportation. And as a consequence, We renege on part of that treaty because we buy back some of that treaty, and we essentially give up on trying to stop the raidings into Mexico. Well, that creates problems on both sides of the border, continues on and on. So Mexico has this perspective. Gringos up north are not living up to the situation. They're allowing these people to come raid in our country, steal our goods, kill our people, and go north. But simultaneously, we're buying cattle and horses and things that the raiders coming down from as they rode through the, come through John Slaughter's ranch, the old days of Texas John Slaughter, one of the much aggrandized characters in good old Disney Wonderful World of Color that, bigger than life, a guy that, was played by a guy, handsome, Tom Tyron, who was 6 foot whatever and looked like the ultimate, handsome, rugged Westerner, outdid John Wayne when it came to that. Well, John Slaughter looked like me, about 5'4", grizzled, old Texas guy. Was he was a racist. He was many other things. And as you point out, tough as nails. These Texans coming in to Arizona, bringing their cattle, bringing, all the things that they bring, amongst others. And then the other groups that are here already, the Mexican Americans, and in certain respects, some of those Mexican Americans are transports. There's a guy who has a ranch in Mexico who's does pretty well for himself. He's come from Germany. He passes through the U.S., Mexico, starts a ranch, and then says, "Hey, my wife died. I'm going to leave my oldest son behind, who's a tough as nails Mexican militia or officer, or kind of the National Guard officer down there, who's hard on any Indians in their area because they're fighting for their cattle and their ranches." And that guy comes up and establishes a second family with a new wife and new kids, offspring. Guy's name is Ronstadt. Might have heard of him. He's got a granddaughter here in Tucson that I think used to sing in the old days. Well, these are guys coming from all over the world trying to make what they can out of this world. The Apaches are trying to make what they can out of this world. And ultimately, the last real holdout are the Apaches. All the other Indian groups are subdued and are on reservations by the 1880s for all intents and purposes. And it's this Geronimo, G-Man, who hates the Mexicans, who does not want to come in into the whites and others. He might be seen as a fiendish foe who has absolutely no morals. He might be seen as a freedom fighter to some, but even his own people are divided. After a while, he's causing so much troubles. It's like certain of his group of the Apaches and other Apaches, as well as other Native peoples, will serve as scouts for the U.S. Army to bring him in. And so in 1886, that's what happens. And he finally is sent to Florida, and then from Florida elsewhere, and is kept in as a POW until his death in the early 20th century at Fort Sill Reservation. And then and only then are all those POWs that were brought back with him are released, but they're not allowed back into Arizona. They're given a choice to stay at Fort Sill, or they're given a choice to join their brethren, the Mescalero Apaches, in New Mexico, heading north from White Sands towards Santa Fe, and what is one of the most exquisite reservations, one of the few places that Native people still reside on their own land and have the ability to carry on and is definitely want to carry on in any country.
I put myself on mute because there's an airplane flying overhead.
We usually have that happen.
So you're talking about this Mexican-American conflict and how the Apaches fit in and their ranchers. Were there, look, if wherever there's young guys, there's guys trying to prove their worth, right? And so they might come from Kansas down to Tucson to hire on with some crew because they want to have the roughest, most toughest, most warringest version of ranch handing available. Is that a draw nationally or regionally for young men who are like, I need to fight?
There's a draw that there are these adventuresome men who bought into the dime novel and the Wild West show of Buffalo Bill and such, and looking to escape the humdrum of their farm life. Some guys from Midwest wanted the humdrum life to see if they could do out west. They would move to places like Dodge City and then to Tombstone. Their name was the Earps. And these guys were, I'm sorry, they were not, they were not Hugh O'Brien. They're not the clean cut all American guys. They were guys who would bend the law when it suited them, and they were not the kinder, gentler type of guys who came west. And with those people who were, and with those people also came people who were more open-minded. So you would have the Ronstedts and you would have the Goldwaters and others coming west to establish mercantile operations, getting involved in politics, establishing culture from the standpoint of what we would consider Western, meaning not wild Western culture, but the culture of what Europe, so opera and music and art and the refinements of so-called civilization. So there's a mix of these people, and they're all out, like anybody else, trying to make a living. And of course, in the middle of all these people are people who've been hundreds and thousands of years. If you watch the latest research, there is now research that seems to indicate that there were humans looking for the mammoth, looking for the sloth, the giant sloth, so about 23,000 years ago on white sands. The last place you would think anybody would want to live, well, the white sands 20,000 years ago isn't the white sands that it is today. And so these people are ancient people on this continent that are going to be in the way, and either they succumb or they're placed on reservations or they're wiped. Now, our government, in and of themselves, never fully embraced something like genocide. As a matter of fact, a U.S. president attempted a so-called peace policy where he tried to bring in Quakers and other religious groups that were actually more open-minded and more interested in the well-being of the native people than just getting reservations, exploiting the people, becoming the agents so they could skim off the top and become wealthy themselves. So there were some people like that, and a man named John Clum, who had a somewhat religious background, but had been a young soldier, and then changed stripes to become an Indian agent, and ultimately the mayor of Tombstone when the Earps are there, amongst other things, a newspaper editor and such. There's these very complex people, all have different approaches to things, and they may be not much different than our approaches today. That, oh my God, I got to be ruthless in my job so that I can buy out the biggest .com company, so I am the biggest .com company, and so there's humans are humans, and the past is not the same as today, but older. It's different. We can't look at the past other than try and determine why people did things, and perhaps more importantly, why people shouldn't do the same things today if we deem that to be the wrong thing to do. Again, it's easy to talk about, and if you and I are amenable, we're good neighbors. I don't have to put up a fence. Your kids play with, my yard, and my kids play in your yard, and that sort of thing. And it's all well and good, but nations don't tend to be good neighbors oftentimes. And going back to your lead-in question, we still have problems with Mexico today that we're still reaping the harvest of what we sowed during the war with Mexico.
Yes, we are.
There's just no Apaches.
Right. The ancient people in a land are, if they still exist, the Assyrians, the Chaldeans, these people that have been around for as long as there's really been history and people. There's no Sumerians anymore. There's no Carthaginians. Most of them get wiped out. I guess, I don't know. It just, it's interesting when you think about, like, we talk about Native Americans, but to be an American, you have to have Amerigo Vespucci, and we have to have Europeans here, right? Like, what is truly native to this area? And did they come from somewhere else, or did they actually generate here? And, you can get lost in these things, but when you think about the history of the Americas, there's a lot of conflict. And yes, the Europeans brought new conflict, but there was always conflict, and there was always upheaval, and there are societies we don't know what happened to them, and maybe it was disease, maybe they got killed to the last person by another group. We don't have that history, right?
Actually, that's true. We refer to that we've made up, just like we made up the name Apache or Sioux or Cheyenne or what have you. And actually, you have these ancient, the Hohokam, the Anasazi, all these pre-Puebloan peoples, and we have these ruins, in all these areas. Where did the people go? Where are all their bodies? Why are these kivas and these communities that have very sophisticated, evidently religious beliefs and culture, and they have irrigation that's very well engineered, and pre-computer and all these wonderful things that we think that we are marking on today, because this is still the best around. I would hope, well, not for me, but for perhaps other people. And as a consequence, what did happen to the people? Are the people in some of these? And the Pueblos, when Conquista do Coronado comes to Francisco Coronado comes westward, or actually northward out of Mexico on this long track all the way up into essentially in Kansas, and doesn't find the 7 cities of gold that he's looking for, etc. And followed by Oñate and others. They all establish, essentially first in New Mexico, these outposts, and will bring the sword and the cross, and they will try and make these Pueblo people who have ancient cultural traditions of very rich history and their own origin stories. We've always been here. We didn't come from somewhere else. We came out of the earth here. We didn't come from some language like anthropologists would say. And so we have our own origin story. We have Adam and Eve. So depending on your belief system, what is true, what is true in your own mind is what's thought true, whether it is or not. And as a consequence, the Pueblo finally give up. What, we've had it with these Spaniards, and they outdo the Apaches by leaps and bounds. They actually come up with a system to gather everyone together into a cohesive effort to attack simultaneously all the Spanish missions in Santa Fe, where all the people are joining in and they're holding up in the governor's palace, which is the equivalent of vacations in that particular area of any substantial size. And they drive the Spanish back in Mexico. And ultimately, they will be back, so to speak, into the fold, or back into the fold, because the Spanish begin to change their way of dealing with the Pueblos. No, we're not going to cut off your left foot, to punish you, and you've got to be a Christian, and you've got to do all these things we tell you to do. We become more cohesive in our approach, more diplomatic, and more symbiotic, if you will. Symbiotic goes back to the topic of the beginning of the hour. It's the Apaches, that's their common enemy. The old saying, the enemy of my enemy is my friend, is often true here. But the Pueblos will strike and drive out the Spanish. And there was a minor degree of that happening in California in the mid 18th century into the 1860s, 70s period. But it doesn't succeed, because ultimately the technology and the sheer numbers of people coming from the United States will be the thing that will change everything. So today there is an Apache reservation at Fort Apache. There is one at Mescalero. There is one at Fort Sill, etc. And these reservations run from amazingly stunning beauty and awe-inspiring. I just got back from Mescalero a few weeks ago, and remember to places that were like San Carlos, which were hellholes that no Indian group ever wanted to be in. That wasn't their traditional land, and there was a reason for it. There was nothing that they could sustain themselves and to become farmers in a place that somebody coming from the old world who had been a farmer for all their generations that they could see couldn't make it go of it. So too would be the problem with the Apaches. So complex, never resolved 100% to anybody's satisfaction, I don't think. There were a lot of losers, a few winners, and a conflict along our border today that harkens back to a time that no one's around to remember.
Yeah. So you're saying it's real simple and straightforward. We should make grand generalizations about all of it.
Yeah, well, we can't. That's the problem. If everything is so complex, we can't generalize. And so people who come up with these grand, glorious theses of, as they say, like settler colonialism, that's all well and good, I guess, when you're defending your doctoral dissertation. But the reality is it goes beyond anything that is that simple to explain the world as we know it. So I can't explain most of the things I've done in my life, much less try and look back on George Crook, one of the generals who was out here, was fairly humane and somewhat tried to look through the lens or the point of view of the Native American. I certainly don't understand Cochise or any of these other people. I don't even understand 100% why my own people left Canada in the 1640s from Normandy, where they got lobster overdose, you know?
The day in the life of an Apache, you know, it's again, these are people that are, as far as I understand, are raiders, right? And so, yes, they're going to have some people that farm, but they also, if they need something, they're going to find someone to go take it from them, right? And you also have to, you can't just marry within your tribe. You've got to do all this intermingling of people and everything. How hard was it to be an Apache in the late 1800s? Was it even a survivable thing? As you know, like if they're on a reservation, who wants to be on a reservation, right? There's no plot of land big enough when you're a people that can run, when like the women can run 50 miles in a day. You know, I mean, these things have their limits in terms of culture. So what was it like to be Apache?
Well, that's the whole thing is the Apaches did a little bit, some groups, particularly the White Mountain, it seems, did a little bit of farming, but very rudimentary stuff. They were hunter-gatherers, but they also found people like the Tohoto O'odham, the Aquila O'odham, and the Pueblo people who grew maize, they grew squash, they had sophisticated systems of living in a static place as opposed to a wickiup where take branches and put them together and you live there for a little while and you move on. And so in good times it's tempting to raid these people. In bad times, when everybody's suffering drought and famine that comes with drought, then it becomes even more of a matter of survival that you go out to make sure your children, your family, your mother, your parents, whoever your extended, because these are extended families, and again they're intermarried oftentimes from the Chokan group to the Bedokake group or what have you. They have all these relationships, and again, what's the term Inde mean? It means the people. they're the people. I'm not part of the people. I'm not one of them. You're not part of them. So what's the problem? I'm not raiding my people. I'm raiding on behalf of my people so that they may survive in a very harsh environment. And Arizona's gone through many, like all the earth, many changes in its environment. And there were some years worse than other years. And the Apaches had to live in an exceedingly harsh environment where they had to do with very little water, very little food, very little of everything. So these were the ultimate, one of these reality shows. No one could compete with an Apache of old, whether it be a man, woman, or child. In the old days, there was no such thing as a non-combatant. When the village was attacked, the women and children were just as susceptible to being casualties as the men themselves. A few of the women actually were warriors, but much has been made of that. But I think maybe overly so, because some of the oral traditions have gone into oral history has gone into oral traditions, and oral traditions tend to build up sometimes superpowers and super things. For instance, my oral tradition is that I was 6'8" and I was cut from the NBA. I'm the original Dr. J, and I'm sticking to that story.
It strikes me funny that the Apaches are clinging onto land as hard as they can, trying to eke out this existence. And then you have the army and all its different outposts, Huachuca, all the other ones around the area. And you wrote this fantastic book about Powhatan Clarke. He's a Medal of Honor winner who was really like like you talked. This is what you told me. He's like the first special forces team. He gathered the buffalo soldiers that he wanted, and those guys would go out and hunt Indians. But in his career, the amount of days he spent in the field, and this guy doesn't live to be very old at all, but it's not many, right? And so it's like the Army had more administrative tasks than they had war tasks. I'm not saying that there wasn't a war, but it's like I don't know if you could estimate how many days he spent in the field. It's not 400, it's not even a year, I don't think. And so we have this war going on, but we're not acting like we really want to win it. We're just, and the guys that go out, how many days do they actually find the Apache? It's very rare, right? So you have these small skirmishes, but it is protracted the amount of time. Talk a little bit about that and give us the scope of the size, space, and time and provisioning.
Well, again, Paul Hutton's book, great work on the Apache Wars, kind of takes the period from 1861 to 1886. That's the most intense period, particularly post-Civil War, immediate post-Civil War in the last couple of years. At one point in time, people use the term 25% of the Army. That's not true. It's 20%. That's splitting hairs, but percentages are big. There's about 4,000 guys in the field on an army of about 25,000 on Geronimo's case, plus a bunch of those yahoos that you're talking about, ranchers and whatever, that they're butch and they're forming the Arizona, whatever, the Tucson Rangers, and they're going to go out and with the marshal or the sheriff, and Leatherwood, who's an old unreconstructed Southerner, and whip them into shape. And then there's the Mexico on their case, and the Mexican Army. Some of the Mexican Army have been fighting Indians, particularly Apaches, much longer than any Anglo and the U.S. soldier has, and some of those Mexican ranchers and such are pretty tough guys too, and they know the territory. A guy who just come off the boat for $13 a month from Ireland or Germany, what's he know about an Apache or Arizona? So to go to your point about Clarke's in the field like most people, very little. You're spending a lot of time going back into the garrison, getting resupplied, paying off your troops, doing the administrative stuff, filling out the reports. Clarke's, diaries are replete, including all these notes that when he had to sit on courts martial, which is, one of those things young officers have to do. And he's the adjutant. He says at one point to his folks, he says, when I get out of the Army, I can become a clerk in a store, because I know how to keep up the commissary records or what have you. But Clarke's not stupid. Not only does he handpick his guys from a couple of troops of the so-called Buffalo Soldiers, which term people kind of understand what it is, so you have to speak the lingua franca. But he also handpicks Apache scouts. And these scouts are, to use General George Crook's term, it takes diamond dust to polish a diamond. In other words, it takes an Apache to bring down that. Clarke is some really great Apache scouts and the Apache scout with a great name, Cody. And how much that can get for a name of a scout? I think Clint Eastwood stole the name for his character in Rawhide. But these are shot units, and they're trying to out Indian the Indians, and that's one of the things that John Burke, who's one of the aides to Crook, says. He says, you got two things you can do. You can either try and turn a white soldier into an Indian, I'm paraphrasing, or you can take an Indian and use them against the other Indians, as Crook would do with some success. And there's some technology they're trying. When Crook is ousted because of some errors he's made, and he's moved on, and he had captured Geronimo and brought him in after years of fighting, then a fellow by the name of Nelson Miles, who had been a store clerk prior to the Civil War and a Medal of Honor recipient during the war, would use technology like the heliograph, one of those, site-to-site systems before, say, can you hear me now with the cell phone? This was, could you see me now from the next peak? And tried that and some other things, and essentially put the scouts on ice for a while, but brought the scouts back. And at the end, the scouts were important to bring in. And they also did another thing in Clarke's diaries and other places, obviously, you can find this. They began to take people who were friendly on the reservation, at the so-called San Carlos Reservation, off the reservation and strip them away and send them first to New Mexico, where if they went back in and tried to get resupplied, because they couldn't make bullets, they didn't make things like that. They needed firearms, they needed various things. They couldn't go back into the reservation and use those people as a source of support as they slipped back in. And so they deported several Apaches. And in essence, it was, while it's cruel, there was a reason for it. At one time, Geronimo made a raid onto the reservation and forced, essentially kidnapped, a large body of Apaches to take into Mexico with him who did not want to go. And one of those Apaches had his family killed during a raid, probably by the Mexican forces, got them out of the camp because he was always being watched because he was a captive by his own people. And he became a fellow who helped lead the troops back into Mexico because he had been with Geronimo and knew the most recent hiding places and where Geronimo was raiding and holing up. So he turned state's evidence, so to speak, and became one of his scouts. So a very complex world. It was not just one-sided as in any world.
Yeah. You've studied this stuff decades. It's your career. What's the most interesting part? Like when you get to do something, what do you want to do next? I guess probably the next thing, because you get to do so many interesting things.
Well, what I want to do next is I wrote a very bad study for the National Park Service. I submitted 800 plus pages on the black soldiers in the post-Civil War. It was poorly done. I'm not happy with it. It's like I gave you all this great stuff in your pantry, but I make you a decent meal. So I'm going to go back and try and clean that up a little bit. And I'm looking at a possibility of a couple of more tours for, I don't do personal tours. Actually, I work for tour companies because it's, believe me, putting together the logistics tour is just, it can be a nightmare. And so I do a tour of Custer and Crazy Horse Country, and I did this Apache tour, which we'll see if it has legs or not. I was not satisfied with some of the outcome, and part of that, I hate to say it, was some of the things I thought we could tour, which sounded like a great idea because they were things I did back when I was in my 20s, but they aren't things you can do when you and most of the people on this big bus are in their 70s. So
yeah.
More practical.
Arizona is still rough country,
and,
especially I-10,
I got to tell you, I miss my daughter in California, and I miss certain things out there. But I'll probably find my ashes scattered at old Fort Lowell someday if I have my way. So I'm kind of entrenched and back home now. I'm happy to be here. There's a lot of things to do. Reopen one of the local museum forts in town, and there's some writing I want to do. I can improve my writing better than the last job I just did. And so there's a few things to be done. And I wish I could just do one crack at an American Experience as a show on the black soldier in 50 years after the Civil War. I would be happy to do that. But so far, David McCullough or no one has knocked on my door yet.
Love it. Hey, listen, I appreciate you being on the show. Do you want to say anything else in closing? Otherwise, I'm going to wrap it up.
No, let's wrap it up, my friend, and then come out and get some good Mexican food with me next time you're driving down to El Paso or elsewhere.
Yes. Yeah. But that restaurant in Benson that you recommended was Aces. I love that place. Stand by. I'll shut this thing down.
Hey, thanks for watching the show. I really appreciate it. Right here, you can subscribe. Please do that. It makes the show grow. Hit that notification bell so you know which incredible guest is coming up next. Down below is the PayPal link. You can put a small subscription in. That is an enormous help. All that money goes right back into the show. And then right up over here are the next episodes you should listen to, curated by yours truly.